What if the most fascinating person you know, the one who overflows with charisma, who has 1,000 talents, who seems to live on a higher plane of existence is, in fact, the most incomplete? Think of that friend who starts 5 brilliant projects and finishes none. Think of that magnetic woman who captures every gaze but flees from any love that threatens to become real. They are not just free spirits. They are the prisoners of an illusory freedom. They inhabit a gilded prison called infinite potential, a place where anything is possible, and, for that very reason, nothing ever becomes real. This condition has an ancient name, a psychological code that echoes through the myths: Puer Aeternus, the eternal boy, and Puella Eterna, the eternal girl. They are the bearers of a divine light that, for fear of touching the ground, ends up becoming a shadow that consumes life itself. They fly too close to the sun, not out of courage, but out of dread for the weight of reality. And the fall, when it happens, is silent, internal, and devastating. Today, we will not just analyze this archetype. We will deliver the escape map from this prison that many do not even know they inhabit. Now, pay very close attention. What we are about to unveil here goes far beyond a simple video. It is a key. To ensure you don't miss any part of this code, do 3 things right now. First, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, because this journey is a deep descent and each video is a step. To miss one is to get lost on the way. Second, leave a like on this video now, not as an empty gesture, but as a seal, a symbolic act that declares to your unconscious that you are ready to stop being a spectator of your life and start being the protagonist. And third, and most importantly, comment the word journey below. This is our signal. This is how I will know that you have crossed the threshold and are committed to going all the way. Do it now and prepare yourself. The descent begins. The journey to unravel the Puer Aeternus begins not with a concept, but with a feeling. A diffuse and persistent feeling that haunts the modern soul. The melancholy of unlimited freedom. It is the anguish that arises on a Sunday night, not because of the approaching work week, but from the emptiness of a weekend filled with activities that nourished nothing essential. It is the vertigo of opening a dating app and being confronted with hundreds of faces, each representing a possible life, which makes it impossible to choose and commit to one real life. This restlessness is what Carl Jung would call divine nostalgia, a longing for a home we never had, because this home is not a place, but a state of being, the state of integration, of belonging to oneself. The Puer and the Puella feel this nostalgia acutely, but misinterpret it. They believe the cure for this restlessness is more movement, more novelty, more options. If the current relationship becomes monotonous, the solution is to find a new, more exciting partner. If the chosen career demands effort and routine, the solution is to jump to a new field that promises more passion. They become butterfly hunters, accumulating beautiful and ephemeral moments, without realizing that true beauty lies in cultivating a garden, a process that requires patience, dedication, and the dirty work of dealing with the soil, the pests, and the seasons. The secret pain of the Puer is not the lack of freedom, but the dread of using it. Every choice is an act of renunciation. To choose one path is to renounce all others, for the inflated psyche of the eternal youth, which identifies with the infinite, any limit is experienced as an unbearable death. They prefer the fantasy of being able to be anything to the reality of being something, and so they live like ghosts in their own lives, haunting the corridors of their unrealized potential. Contemporary society, with its culture of instant gratification, exacerbates this condition, selling the idea that happiness is a state of perpetual excitement. But the soul does not yearn for excitement, it yearns for meaning. And meaning is not found in the breadth of experience, but in the depth of commitment. The first step towards healing is, therefore, the most difficult, to recognize that your freedom is your cage, and that the door is locked from the inside with the key of fear. One must dare to feel the boredom, the frustration, the discomfort of remaining. It is in this silence, in this forced stillness, that the voice of the soul, so long muffled by the noise of escape, can finally be heard. And what it whispers is the call to the true journey, the journey back home, to the center of oneself, to the firm ground of embodied reality. To understand the power of an archetype, we must return to its origin, to the time when gods walked through the human imagination. The Puer Aeternus is not an invention of psychology, but an eternal figure that inhabits the collective unconscious. He is Icarus, the craftsman's son, who is given wings to escape the labyrinth, a symbol of the world's complexity. His father, Daedalus, the conscious adult, gives him the crucial instruction, the middle path. Do not fly too low, for the unconscious, depression will soak your wings. Do not fly too high, for the sun pure spirit, ego inflation will melt the wax. But Icarus, intoxicated by the feeling of power and divinity, forgets the advice. He soars towards the absolute, seeking union with the Father-Son, a fusion that would annihilate his human individuality. The fall is the inevitable consequence of hubris, of the arrogance of considering oneself above the laws of matter. This myth is the precise diagnosis of the Puer's psyche. He lives in a labyrinth of indecision and, to escape, seeks a spiritual solution, a flight that spares him the work of walking the corridors. He falls in love with ideologies, with gurus, with grandiose projects that promise instant transformation. He despises the middle path, the gradual work, the slow and steady progress. He wants everything now, and this urgency leads him to repeated falls that he never understands as his own making, blaming the system, others, or bad luck. His counterpart, the Puella Eterna, the eternal girl, finds her roots in the myth of Persephone, the maiden who lives in an eternal, flowery meadow under the protection of her mother, Demeter. Her life is one of sterile beauty, without transformation. It is only when Hades, the god of the underworld, abducts her and takes her to the depths that her journey of individuation begins. She becomes the queen of the underworld, learning about the shadow, death, and rebirth. The modern Puella, however, refuses the abduction. She remains in the meadow, waiting for a charming prince, not a dark king. She fears the underworld of her own passions, her anger, her sexuality. She fears the death that a real commitment represents to her image as a perfect and untouched maiden. Her waiting is a form of paralysis. While the Puer sins by an excessive, uncoordinated action, the Puella sins by paralyzing inaction. Both, however, share the same fundamental wound, the refusal to accept the duality of existence. They want the light without the shadow, the flight without gravity, the spring without the winter. The analysis of these myths is not an academic exercise, it is a mirror. In which of these patterns do you recognize yourself? Are you the one who flies and falls repeatedly, or the one who waits for a rescue that never comes? Recognizing the myth that governs your life is the first step to rewriting it, no longer as a tragedy of repetition, but as a conscious journey of integration, where heaven and earth finally meet within your soul. Identifying the Puer Aeternus in oneself or in others requires a gaze that penetrates beyond the charming surface. The symptoms are subtle, often disguised as desirable qualities. The first and most evident sign is in professional life. The Puer is often a job hopper. He starts at a company with overwhelming enthusiasm, is seen as a rising star, full of innovative ideas. However, as soon as the novelty phase passes and the work demands discipline, routine, and overcoming bureaucratic obstacles, he begins to feel trapped, limited. The company, which was once the dream workplace, becomes a prison for the soul. He then finds a new project, a new career, and the cycle repeats. He accumulates a resume of brilliant beginnings, but his portfolio of concrete accomplishments is frighteningly empty. He lives a provisional life, always with the feeling that his real work is yet to come, indefinitely postponing the moment to commit to a path and deepen his skills. The second symptom manifests in romantic relationships. The Puer is a master of the passion phase. He idealizes his partner, projecting onto her the archetype of the anima, the image of his soul. The romance is intense, cinematic. However, when the projection inevitably recedes and he is confronted with the real woman, with her needs, flaws, and demands, he feels an overwhelming claustrophobia. Love, which was synonymous with freedom and expansion, becomes a responsibility, a routine. He starts finding faults in his partner, feeling misunderstood, and dreaming of an ideal woman who surely exists somewhere. He doesn't end the relationship cleanly. He distances himself emotionally, creates conflicts, sabotages intimacy until the other person, exhausted, leaves him. This allows him to maintain the fantasy that he was not the one who gave up, but that the relationship didn't work out, preserving his image as a victim of circumstances. The third sign is a general pattern of behavior. He has a pathological fear of boredom and routine. His life is a relentless search for stimuli, trips, parties, courses, hobbies. However, his approach is always superficial. He learns to play the first notes of a song on the guitar, but never studies to master the instrument. He travels to exotic places, but spends more time taking pictures to post than living the experience. He is, essentially, a consumer of beginnings. Behind all this lies what Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's foremost student, called a mother complex. The Puer remains psychologically attached to an archetypal image of the all-providing, non-demanding mother. The adult world, with its demands and consequences, is seen as a tyrant father who prevents him from remaining in this paradise of irresponsibility. Recognizing these signs is painful, as it requires admitting that one's identity as a free and creative spirit may largely be a facade for fear and immaturity. It is a diagnosis that wounds the ego, but is absolutely essential for true healing to begin. The Puer Aeterna, the eternal girl, shares the same axis of immaturity as her male counterpart, but her manifestation is often more passive, more internal, making her even harder to diagnose. If the Puer is in constant flight, the Puella is in a constant state of waiting. She inhabits a castle of dreams, a psychological fortress built to protect her from the rawness and imperfection of the real world. The central symptom of the Puella is her relationship with the future. She lives in a fantasy state about what life will bring her. She waits for the perfect man who will discover her and give her existence meaning. She waits for the purposeful career that will magically appear, without her needing to go through the arduous process of trial and error. She waits for divine inspiration to write her book or paint her masterpiece. This waiting is her primary form of resistance against adult life. Committing to a real man would mean abandoning the fantasy of all the other better men who might come along. Committing to a real job would mean getting her hands dirty and perhaps discovering she is not as brilliant as she imagined. For the Puella, potentiality is safer and more seductive than reality. Behind this paralysis, we usually find a powerful father complex. She may have had a father who idolized her, treating her like an untouchable little princess, creating a standard so high that no mortal man can reach it. Or, conversely, she may have had an absent or critical father, leading her to spend her life seeking that paternal approval in other men, projecting onto them the figure of an idealized savior. In her relationships, the Puella operates differently from the Puer. She doesn't actively flee. She passively sabotages. She may seem dedicated and present, but maintains a secret emotional distance, a part of herself that never surrenders. She is the muse who inspires men, but never steps down from the pedestal. To be a flesh and blood partner, she fears her own intensity, her sexuality, her anger, which she calls not being a nice person. She fears the mother archetype, not in the sense of having children, but in the sense of becoming a generative and nurturing force in the world, as this implies responsibility, sacrifice, and aging. Her escape is not to the sky, like the Puer's, but into ethereal spirituality, into the world of arts, of philosophy, any domain that keeps her on the plane of ideas and protects her from the plane of matter. She may have profound knowledge of psychology or esotericism, but rarely applies this wisdom to her own life. She collects theories as the Puer collects experiences. The Puella's awakening is often brutal. It happens when she realizes the prince is not coming, that time has passed, and that the walls of her dream castle have become the bars of a prison of loneliness and regret. The cure for the Puella requires a downward movement, a yes to the earth. It requires her to dare to be imperfect, to fail, to be disappointed, and to disappoint others. It requires her to trade the fantasy of external salvation for the difficult but liberating task of becoming her own heroine, of building her own kingdom, not in the heavens of imagination, but on the fertile and challenging ground of real life. Beneath the charming, creative, and spiritually elevated facade of the Puer and Puella lies a deep and dangerous shadow. It is a shadow they themselves refuse to see, as it would threaten their entire self-image. This shadow is woven with the threads of narcissism, arrogance, and a surprising unconscious cruelty. The narcissism of the eternal youth is not necessarily the grandiose, exhibitionistic type. It is a more subtle narcissism, rooted in a feeling of being special. They feel fundamentally different from and superior to the ordinary people who live normal lives. They despise routine, the 9-to-5 job, long-term marriages, not because they have found a better path, but because they feel too artistic or spiritual for such trivialities. The sense of superiority is a defense mechanism that protects an extremely fragile ego. Deep down, the Puer and Puella are terrified by the idea of being ordinary, that if they truly committed to something and failed, the illusion of their limitless potential would be shattered. Therefore, it is safer never to truly try. This attitude leads to a form of passive arrogance. They silently judge those who have made choices and built lives, seeing them as conformists or unimaginative, without ever recognizing the courage and resilience required to sustain a long-term commitment. The cruelty of the Puer, Puella manifests in their inability to see others as complete human beings. Instead, other people become objects in service of their personal journey. The romantic partner is not an individual with their own needs and wounds, but a mirror to reflect their own grandiosity or a scapegoat for their frustrations. When the initial idealization fades, the partner is discarded with shocking coldness because he or she has ceased to fulfill their function in the Puer, Puella's narcissistic drama. They are the heartbreakers who leave a trail of confusion and pain, genuinely confused as to why the other person is so hurt, because, in their mind, the relationship was just a phase, an experience. They use people like train stations on their journey to a destination they never reach. This shadow also reveals itself in a profound irresponsibility. They forget commitments, miss deadlines, borrow money, and don't pay it back, not because they are bad people, but because they operate from a center of childish entitlement, where they believe the rules of the adult world do not apply to them. They expect someone, a parent, a partner, a friend, to always show up and clean up their mess. Confronting this shadow is the most critical point in the healing journey. It requires the Puer, Puella, to look in the mirror and see not a free spirit, but a selfish person, not a sensitive soul, but someone who uses sensitivity as an excuse to hurt others. It is a humbling process that involves developing empathy, taking responsibility for the consequences of their actions, and recognizing the nobility and dignity in the ordinary life they so despised. It is the moment when the divine child must die so that the decent, mature human being can be born. Romantic relationships are the battlefield where the drama of the Puer and Puella unfolds most explicitly and painfully. They are addicted not to love, but to infatuation, the liminal state of the beginning, where everything is projection and possibility. The cycle is as predictable as it is tragic and can be divided into 4 distinct phases. The first phase is magical idealization. When the Puer, Puella, finds a new love interest, he or she does not see the real person. They see the incarnation of their anima in the case of the man, or animus in the case of the woman. The loved one becomes a blank canvas onto which they project all their fantasies of salvation, completeness, and perfection. The partner is the most incredible person they have ever met, the soulmate who finally understands them. This phase is of overwhelming intensity, filled with grand gestures and declarations of eternal love. It is a powerful drug, both for the Puer, Puella, and for their partner, who feels seen and adored as never before. The second phase is the infiltration of reality. Inevitably, the partner's humanity begins to show through. He has bad breath in the morning, has insecurities, disagrees on opinions, has bad days. For a mature psyche, these are normal elements that lead to deeper intimacy. For the Puer, Puella, each imperfection is a crack in the perfect statue they have sculpted. Routine begins to set in. The conversation, which was once about dreams and stars, now includes paying bills and who will do the dishes. This is the moment when the eternal youth begins to feel a growing anxiety, a sense of claustrophobia. The magic is fading. The third phase is active or passive devaluation. The partner, who was once the source of all salvation, is now seen as the cause of their imprisonment. The Puer, Puella, begins to criticize, to find faults, to complain that the partner has changed. In reality, it was the projection that receded. What was once seen as down-to-earth is now boring and unambitious. What was caring is now controlling. They begin to distance themselves emotionally, to seek validation outside the relationship, to create conflicts to justify their growing desire to escape. The Puer may use the weapon of silence and victimhood, while the Puer may use the weapon of absence and emotional or physical infidelity. The fourth and final phase is the escape to a new beginning. The breakup is rarely clean. The Puer needs to see themselves as the victim, as the one who tried everything but was suffocated. They leave the relationship not with sadness for the loss, but with a euphoric relief for their recovered freedom. And almost immediately, their radar starts searching for a new object to idealize, a new blank canvas to start the cycle all over again. They do not learn from the experience because they never integrate it. They simply repeat the pattern, convinced that the problem was the previous partner, and that, next time, with the right person, it will be different. The only way to break this cycle is for the Puer to shift the focus from the partner to themselves, asking, what in me is causing this repetition? This requires the courage to be alone, to face the inner emptiness they try to fill with the intensity of new loves, and finally, to learn to give themselves the love and validation they desperately project onto others. There is a safety mechanism in the psyche, a turning point that the ancient Greeks called an anxiodromia, the principle that everything, when taken to its extreme, inevitably turns into its opposite. For the Puer and Puella, who have spent the first half of their lives at an extreme of youth, freedom, and potential, the midlife crisis is the moment when the opposite emerges with volcanic force. It is the forced awakening of the soul's clock. What was once charming, the spontaneity, the refusal to settle down, now begins to look pathetic. At 25, being a struggling artist living from project to project is romantic. At 45, without a career, without savings, and still depending on others, it is tragic. The woman who at 30 was a mysterious muse at 50 risks becoming a lonely and bitter figure. The mirror, which once reflected the promise of eternal youth, now shows the undeniable signs of time, the wrinkles, the gray hair, the body that no longer has the same energy. Death, which was an abstract concept, becomes a palpable reality. Friends are married, with children, with mortgages. They have built something. The Puella looks back and sees a trail of beginnings, a desert of abandoned projects and failed relationships. The freedom they so valued reveals its true face, loneliness. The infinite potential now looks like a vast ocean of regret. Jung described midlife as the afternoon of life. In the morning, our task is to establish ourselves in the outer world, build a career, form relationships, create a persona. In the afternoon, the task is internal, confront the shadow, develop spirituality, and prepare for finitude. The Puer and Puella try to live in a perpetual mourning. The midlife crisis is the sunset they can no longer ignore. This crisis can be triggered by an external event, a layoff, the end of a relationship, the death of parents who were often the enablers of their immaturity, or a health problem. Suddenly, the safety net disappears. The world stops applauding their potential and starts demanding results. The anguish they felt before, which was muffled with new distractions, becomes a deafening roar. Depression, anxiety, and panic attacks are common at this stage. It is the psyche screaming that the current life model is no longer sustainable. This is a moment of danger and opportunity. The danger is to succumb to despair, trying to recapture youth in pathetic ways. The man who buys a sports car and starts dating much younger women, the woman who undergoes excessive plastic surgery. The opportunity is to accept the crisis as a sacred calling, an invitation to finally mourn the youth that is gone and all the lives that were not lived. It is the chance to start building, even if belatedly, a life of substance, meaning, and depth. It is the moment when the eternal youth must finally answer the most adult question of all. Given the time I have left, what will I do with it? The transition from the Puer archetype to that of the conscious adult is not a smooth evolution. It is a rite of passage that demands a sacrifice. Not a literal sacrifice, but a psychological sacrifice of profound magnitude. Marie-Louise von Franz stated bluntly, the Puer Aeternus needs a shot in the head. This violent image illustrates the need for a radical break with the old way of being. What needs to be killed is not the inner child, the source of joy and creativity, but the ego's identification with that child. The ego must renounce the throne of the golden boy and accept the much more humble, yet infinitely more powerful, role of servant to the totality of the psyche, the self. The first aspect of this sacrifice is the sacrifice of potentiality. The Puer must choose one path and commit to it, knowing that this means the death of all other possible paths. He must choose a job and dedicate himself to it, even on days of boredom and frustration. He must finish the project he started, even if the result is imperfect. Perfection is the enemy of completion. By accepting limitation, he paradoxically frees himself from the paralysis of infinite choice. He trades the fantasy of being everything for the reality of being someone. The second is the sacrifice of romantic idealism. The Puer and Puella must abandon the search for the perfect soulmate and commit to a real, imperfect partner. This means learning to navigate conflicts, to negotiate needs, to forgive and be forgiven. It means discovering that true intimacy is not born from perfection, but from the courage to show oneself as vulnerable and to accept the vulnerability of the other. Love ceases to be a quest for ecstasy and becomes a practice of devotion, patience, and friendship. The third and most difficult is the sacrifice of special suffering. The Puer, Puella often clings to an identity of a tortured and misunderstood soul. Their suffering makes them special. To mature, they must renounce this drama. They must accept that suffering, frustration, and disappointment are not signs that something is wrong with their lives, but are inherent components of the human condition. They need to stop complaining about the weight of life and start strengthening their shoulders to carry it. In practice, this sacrifice translates into concrete and often unspiritual actions: paying bills on time, keeping the house clean, exercising regularly, honoring one's word. It is these small acts of responsibility that weave the fabric of a strong and grounded ego. It is the work of planting one's feet so firmly in the earth that no storm of fantasy or despair can uproot them again. This process is painful. It is a grieving. The Puer, Puella will feel that they are betraying themselves, that they are selling out to the system. But what is dying is only the illusion. And on the other side of this sacrificial fire, what emerges is not a conformist automaton, but a truly free individual, free not from responsibilities, but free to take them on and through them create a life of real meaning. It is the birth of the inner king and queen. After the painful sacrifice of identifying with the eternal youth, the journey does not end. On the contrary, the most creative phase begins. The goal was never to eradicate the Puer, Puella archetype, as this would result in a rigid, cynical, and soulless adult, the premature old person. The goal is integration. It is about rescuing the gold that was hidden in the dross of immaturity. Once the ego is grounded in reality, firmly committed to its duties and relationships, it can turn to the inner child no longer as a slave to its whims, but as a wise parent. It can now give this child what it truly needed: a safe playground in which to play. The gold of the Puer is his connection to spirit, his boundless creativity, his ability to see new possibilities, and his refusal to accept the status quo as final. In an unintegrated individual, these qualities manifest as flightiness and lack of focus. In an integrated individual, the man with a strong sense of duty can now use his innovative vision to transform his company from the inside out. The committed family man can use his spontaneity to create a home full of joy, an adventure for his children. His creativity, once scattered, now has a channel, a purpose. He becomes the grounded visionary. The gold of the Puella is her sensitivity, her deep connection to the inner world, her intuition, and her ability to perceive beauty and hidden meaning in things. In the unintegrated woman, this manifests as passivity and escape into fantasy. In the integrated woman, her intuition becomes a powerful compass to guide her real-life decisions. Her sensitivity, which once made her a victim, now transforms into empathy, making her a compassionate therapist, artist, or leader. Her connection to beauty empowers her to create beauty in the world. Whether through art, cultivating deep relationships, or creating a welcoming environment, she becomes the embodied priestess. Integration means that spontaneity now serves discipline, rather than replacing it. It means that the search for meaning coexists with the acceptance of mundane tasks. The integrated individual is able to fill out a task spreadsheet with the same presence with which they write a poem. They understand that the sacred is not only on the mountaintops, but also in the daily routine, in the loyalty to commitments, in the courage to show up day after day. It is the alchemical union of opposites, heaven and earth, spirit and matter, potential and act. The inner child is no longer the tyrannical ruler, but the royal advisor, the one who whispers new ideas in the king's ear, who reminds the queen to dance and sing. The result is an individual who possesses the wisdom of age and the freshness of youth, the strength of the oak and the flexibility of the bamboo. They no longer flee from the world nor wait for the world to save them. They become a co-creator of their own reality, an active participant in the great and mysterious game of life. The final stage of the Puer and Puella's journey of individuation is their transmutation into the archetypes of the king and the queen. This is not a transformation that happens overnight, but the result of countless conscious choices made over time. It is the coronation of sovereignty over one's own inner kingdom. The archetype of the king is not about power over others, but about order, center, and purpose. The king is the axis around which the kingdom, the psyche, revolves. A mature and just king possesses four essential qualities. First, he has an ordering vision. He knows what is important, sets priorities, and creates structure where there was once chaos. He builds. Second, he has a generative function. He not only maintains the kingdom, but makes it prosper. He is fertile in his ideas and actions, blessing those under his care. He creates a legacy. Third, he offers protection. He establishes healthy boundaries, defends his values, and protects the vulnerable parts of himself and his family. He is a fortress. Fourth, he has a connection to the divine. He does not rule from the ego alone, but feels he is in service to something greater, a transcendent purpose. For the recovered Puer, becoming king means ceasing to be the prince who inherits the kingdom and becoming the man who builds and sustains it through his work, his integrity, and his commitment. The archetype of the queen, likewise, represents sovereignty over her domain. The queen is centered, connected to her inner wisdom and inherent worth. She does not need a king to validate her, for her throne is her own self-esteem. The mature queen also possesses fundamental qualities. First, she has a connection to the earth and the body. She is embodied, present, and nourishes herself and others. She flourishes. Second, she possesses intuitive wisdom. She trusts her feelings and her perception, seeing beyond appearances. She sees. Third, she is relational. She weaves the web of connections, cultivates community, and understands that true power lies in the quality of bonds. She unites. Fourth, she embodies the totality of the feminine. She integrates the maiden, the mother, the sorceress, and the crone, being able to be both gentle and fierce, creative and destructive when necessary. For the recovered Puella, becoming queen means ceasing to be the princess waiting in the castle and becoming the sovereign, who governs her own territory with grace, strength, and dignity. This coronation is not a final event. Sovereignty must be reaffirmed every day. The king and queen face constant challenges, the temptation to return to old patterns, the threat of external invaders, criticism, setbacks, and the danger of becoming rigid tyrants. True psychological royalty is dynamic. It requires vigilance, humility, and a continuous connection to that now integrated divine child, who reminds them that even the most powerful kingdom needs space for play, wonder, and renewal. It is the end of the escape and the beginning of the true reign, a life lived not in search of a perfect future, but in the fullness of a meaningful and real present.